The alarm clock didn't ring because William Carson never set one. At 0400 hours, his eyes opened in the darkness of his studio apartment, the same way they had for 54 years. No gradual wake, no drowsy transition from sleep to consciousness, just the binary switch of a mind trained by the Navy to respond to combat stations. His hand reached automatically for the sidearm that hadn't been on the nightstand since 1988, found empty space, and the muscle memory faded into the present. The ghosts were already awake. They spoke his name in the pre-dawn silence. Not screaming, not accusing, just there. 29 voices saying bull in that flat tone men use when they know death is coming and there's nothing to do but wait for it. He'd tried everything over the decades. Medication that turned his thoughts to mud, therapy that picked at wounds until they bled fresh, bourbon that only made the voices louder. Nothing worked. The 29 were permanent residents in his skull, and at 78 years old he'd made peace with that, or something close to peace, something like an armistice with an enemy you could never defeat. The first push-up was the hardest. His shoulders protested, the scar tissue from the 1972 rescue pulling tight across his back. 78-year-old joints grinding against each other, reminding him that bodies weren't meant to last this long when you'd used yours as hard as he'd used his. But discipline mattered more than pain. Always had. He dropped into position on the worn carpet, counted to 3, and pushed. The floor seemed heavier than yesterday. Tomorrow it would be heavier still. That was fine. Push-ups weren't about strength anymore. They were about proving he could still do hard things when everything in him wanted to quit. 1, 2, 3. By 10, his arms shook. By 20, he was breathing through his teeth. By 50, he could hear David's voice from 20 years ago. Come on, old man, 50 more. His son had been 17 then, already enlisted, already proud, already doomed, though neither of them knew it yet. Bull pushed through 70, 80, 90. At 100, he held the plank position for 30 seconds, trembling, then collapsed onto his forearms. The apartment smelled like old coffee and older memories. He'd lived here for 7 years since selling the house after Sarah died. 300 square feet of space that cost $800 a month, too much for what it was, but close to Marcus Corner in the VA clinic, so he stayed. The walls were bare except for 3 photographs in sheep frames. Sarah on their wedding day in 1968, 22 years old with flowers in her hair, and a smile that had convinced him the world might actually be good. David in his navy dress blues at 22, the age Bull had been when he enlisted, the age Sarah had been when she married him. And the crew photo from USS Constellation, 1972. 18 men standing on the flight deck, all of them young, 7 of them dead within a year, 12 more dead by now from various causes. Time and Agent Orange and despair. Bull stood slowly, joints popping like firecrackers. The shower ran cold for 2 minutes before the ancient water heater kicked in. He stood under the spray, letting it beat against the knot of scar tissue between his shoulder blade, where the rescue cable had cut through his wetsuit during the typhoon. The water turned warm, then hot, and he thought about the Pacific that night in October 1972. Water so cold it felt like being stabbed with 1,000 knives, over and over, forever. Some nights in the shower he could still feel it. The uniform came out of the closet in pieces. Blue jeans, worn soft from a decade of washing. Flannel shirt, red and black, because the heating in the apartment was unreliable. Under the flannel, a gray t-shirt that read Rescue Swimmer, Pacific Fleet in faded letters across the chest. Sarah had bought him that shirt in 1975, 3 years after the typhoon, trying to help him wear the identity with pride instead of shame. It hadn't worked then, didn't work now, but he wore it anyway because she'd chosen it, and wearing things she'd touched was the closest he got to holding her hand anymore. The Navy Cross stayed in its blue velvet case in the top drawer of the dresser, tucked under socks he almost never wore. Once a year, on the anniversary of the rescue, he'd take it out and look at it. Just look. Try to see what the Navy had seen. Heroism, courage, selfless action under fire. All Bull saw was a chunk of metal representing 29 failures. 4 men saved didn't balance against 27 drowned. The math didn't work that way. It couldn't. The USS Constellation ball cap sat on top of the dresser, gold letters faded almost to invisibility. He'd bought it at a Navy exchange in 1973, right after they'd pinned the Navy Cross on his chest and promoted him to senior chief. Worn it every day since, through 3 more deployments, through retirement, through Sarah's cancer, through David's funeral. The bill was shaped to his face now, molded by decades of sweat and weather. Putting it on was like putting on armor. His reflection in the bathroom mirror showed a stranger. White hair sticking up at odd angles, face mapped with wrinkles like terrain features on a combat chart, blue eyes that used to be sharp now milky with cataracts he couldn't afford to fix. The man in the mirror was old, ancient, a relic. But when Bull straightened his spine and set his jaw, something else appeared. The ghost of the 24-year-old rescue swimmer who jumped into typhoon waters without hesitation. Still in there somewhere, under all the scar tissue and time. He made coffee in a machine that predated Sarah's death, probably should have been replaced years ago but still worked. So it stayed. The routine mattered. Measure the grounds, 3 scoops, level, because precision was a habit bred into bone by the Navy. Fill the reservoir to the 6-cup line, even though he'd only drink 2. Start the machine and listen to it gurgle and hiss like something dying. While the coffee brewed, Bull performed his second ritual of the morning. He opened his wallet and removed a photograph, protected by a plastic sleeve that had gone cloudy with age. David, at 8 years old, gap-toothed smile, holding up a fish they'd caught it together at Hag Lake. The boy had been so proud. They'd grilled that fish in the backyard while Sarah watched from the porch, laughing. That was before the deployments got bad, before David learned that Dad's nightmares sometimes turned violent, before the distance crept in that neither of them knew how to cross. The last conversation they'd had played on repeat sometimes, right there in the kitchen. David had called from Afghanistan, voice crackling over the satellite connection, saying he was fine, saying the mission was going well, saying he'd be home for Christmas. Bull had been making coffee, the same machine, and he'd said what he always said. Stay safe, keep your head down, come home in one piece. Generic father advice, the kind that didn't mean anything. Didn't say I love you or I'm proud of you or I'm sorry I was a shitty dad for so many years. Just stay safe, and David had said I will, Pop. And 3 days later, the IED took down his helicopter and Bull never got another chance. The coffee finished brewing. Bull poured 1 cup, black, no sugar. Added nothing because the bitterness was part of the ritual, the taste of consequence. He sat at the small Formica table by the window and looked out at Portland, waking up. October darkness giving way to gray dawn, rain starting to tap against the glass. Tuesday, his day. Marcus's corner would open at 6. Bull would arrive at 8:15, same as every Tuesday for 12 years. He'd sit at his table by the window and drink coffee from the blue mug and pretend he was just another old man, killing time before death caught up. And somewhere in that performance, in that routine, he'd find enough reason to make it to Wednesday, then Thursday, then Friday. One day at a time, like the AA people said, though his addiction wasn't alcohol, it was survival itself, and he couldn't quit even when he wanted to. The photograph of the Constellation crew sat on the table, propped against the sugar bowl he never used. Bull traced his finger across the faces. Johnson, killed in a car accident in 1974. Martinez, brain cancer in 1989. O'Reilly, suicide in 1995. Henderson, heart attack in 2003. Each death had carved away a piece of Bull's past until only memories remained. And memories were poor company. They didn't laugh at your jokes or buy you a beer or tell you it was going to be okay. They just sat there, reminding you of what was lost. The wall clock clicked toward 0600. Time to move. Bull rinsed his coffee cup, dried it, put it back in the cupboard. Military precision in all things, even alone in a studio apartment where nobody cared. The discipline was the point. When you let discipline slip, everything else followed. Bull had seen what happened to too many vets. Guys who came home and stopped shaving, stopped showering, stopped getting out of bed. 6 months later, they were dead or homeless or both. The routine was a life raft in deep water. You held on or you drowned. He locked the apartment door behind him, descended 3 flights of stairs because the elevator had been broken for 2 months and the landlord kept promising to fix it but never did. The morning air hit his lungs with November cold that made the old scar tissue in his back seize up. He walked anyway, 6 blocks through the Pearl District, past coffee shops where 20-year-olds sat with laptops and lattes that cost more than Bull's daily food budget, past boutique clothing stores selling distressed jeans for $200 to people who'd never done a day's hard labor. Portland had changed, or maybe Bull had changed and the city stayed the same. Either way, he felt like a ghost walking through someone else's world. The veterans had their corners, Marcus's place, the VFW post on Powell, the VA clinic on Burnside, but everything else belonged to the new Portland, the weird Portland, the Portland that put birds on things and made craft beer a religion. Not better or worse, just different, foreign. Marcus's corner appeared on the corner of Oak and Main like it always did, a brick building that predated Bull's birth by decades. The sign above the door was hand-painted, Marcus's Corner, Coffee and Community. The second-floor windows showed lights on, which meant Marcus was awake up there, probably had been since 0500. Gulf War vets didn't sleep any better than Vietnam vets who didn't sleep any better than the guys from Korea and the big one. Insomnia was democracy. It came for everyone who'd seen combat, regardless of generation. Bull stopped on the sidewalk, looking at the cafe through the rain-streaked window. Sophie would be inside, prepping for the morning rush. Marcus would be manning the espresso machine, moving with the precision of a man who'd once assembled and disassembled an M16 blindfolded. Doc Patterson would be at his usual table, reading medical journals he probably shouldn't have access to anymore, but did anyway because old Navy corpsmen never stopped being medics. And at Bull's table, the corner spot by the window, there would be emptiness. Waiting, like it had every Tuesday for 12 years. That table was his duty station now, the closest thing he had to purpose. Show up, sit down, drink coffee, be present. Simple mission. Even a broken-down old sailor could handle that. He pushed open the door. The brass bell chimed, the real brass bell Marcus had salvaged from a decommissioned destroyer. Because of course he had. The cafe smelled like dark roast and something baking in the back. Probably Sophie's blueberry muffins. The walls were covered with photographs. Not the artistic bullshit you saw in corporate coffee chains, but real photos. Veterans. 200 faces from 200 different eras, all wearing the same expression. I served. I survived. I matter. The centerpiece of the Wall of Honor was a professional portrait of Lieutenant David Carson, Navy, 22 years old, dress blues, silver wings on his chest, American flag in the background. Bull had provided that photo 6 months ago when Marcus expanded the wall. Looking at it hurt in ways that still surprised him. The pain should have dulled by now, 13 years later. It should have scabbed over, scarred, become manageable. Instead, it remained fresh as the morning they'd knocked on his door with folded flags and empty condolences. Marcus Hayes looked up from the espresso machine. 54 years old, 6 feet of muscle going to fat around the middle, scar running from his right shoulder down to his elbow, where the IED shrapnel had carved him like a Christmas ham. He wore the same thing every day. Jeans, black t-shirt, apron that read, "Veterans drink free at Tuesdays." His eyes did the automatic threat assessment. Check the door, check Bull's hands, check the perimeter. Combat reflexes died hard. Morning Bull. Black, no sugar, blue mug. Not a question, just stating facts. Marcus knew the routine better than Bull did sometimes. Morning Gunner. Bull used the old rank nickname, the one Marcus had earned in Desert Storm, by putting 3,000 rounds downrange without jamming his 50 cal. They all had names like that: Bull, Gunner, Doc, Reaper. Call signs from when they'd been warriors instead of old men drinking coffee and pretending the war was over. Sophie emerged from the kitchen carrying a tray of fresh muffins. 35 years old, Marcus's daughter, Iraq War veteran, with the kind of eyes that had seen things no one should see. Army sergeant deployed twice, came home different. The usual story: she'd cut her red hair short last month, military style, said it was easier to manage, but Bull knew better. When the PTSD got bad, people reverted to what felt safe. For Sophie, that was looking like a soldier again. She set the tray down, wiped flour on her apron, and caught Bull's eye. No smile, no good morning, just a nod of recognition. Warriors didn't need small talk. The nod said, I see you, you see me. We both made it through another night. That was enough. Bull walked to his table like a man walking to his post. The corner spot, window view, back to the wall. Tactical positioning burned into muscle memory. The table itself was scarred wood, 40 years old, carved with initials and dates from 1,000 different customers. But underneath, hidden where you could only feel it if you knew it was there, someone had carved Constellation 72, 29 souls. Bull had carved that 6 years ago, late one night when Marcus let him stay after closing. Used his old Navy knife, the one with the anchor on the handle, and spent 2 hours etching names into wood. Not all 29, there wasn't room, but the number, the reminder, the anchor that kept him from floating away entirely. He ran his fingers over the carving, a ritual before sitting down. The wood was smooth now, worn by repetition. This table was consecrated ground. This table was his duty station, his foxhole, his piece of earth to defend. And when he sat down in the wooden chair that creaked under his weight, he felt something like peace, or the ghost of peace. The memory of what peace used to feel like before the ghost moved in. Sophie brought the blue mug without being asked, set it down with the careful precision of someone who knew that routine mattered, that small kindnesses were life rafts for drowning men. Steam rose from the black surface, bringing the bitter smell of dark roast that Bull had been drinking since 1967 when Navy coffee was strong enough to strip paint. Thank you, Sergeant. He used her rank deliberately, reminded her that she'd earned something, that Iraq hadn't just taken from her. It had proved something. She'd stood when standing mattered. That counted. Chief, she used his rank too. In the exchange completed another ritual, another small ceremony that held back chaos for one more day. Doc Patterson sat at the next table, the one that gave him line of sight to both the door and Bull's position. 71 years old, Navy corpsman from Vietnam, the kind of medic who'd saved more lives than some surgeons. White hair pulled back in a ponytail because Doc had always been half hippie, even when he was pulling shrapnel out of Marines in Khe Sanh. He didn't look up from his journal, but his fingers moved across the chessboard between them, advancing a pawn 2 squares. Bull studied the position. They'd been playing this game for 6 years, since the week after Sarah's funeral, when Bull had walked into Marcus' corner, looking for a reason not to eat his service pistol. Doc had been sitting right there, chessboard set up, and without saying a word, he gestured to the empty chair. They'd been playing ever since. Same game. Neither of them had won because winning wasn't the point. The point was to have something to come back to, something unfinished that required tomorrow. Bull moved his knight, protecting his queen. Doc nodded slightly, made a note in his journal. They'd speak later, maybe, or maybe not. The silence between combat veterans was its own language, more eloquent than words. The cafe was filling up now as Portland woke to Tuesday. College students with laptops and textbooks looking to spend 4 hours on one $5 coffee. Freelancers and remote workers claiming tables for the day. A few other veterans Bull recognized, guys from the VFW, guys from the Tuesday Breakfast Club that Danny Knox ran. They nodded to Bull, he nodded back, and that was enough. Marcus moved through the space with controlled efficiency, pulling espresso shots, steaming milk, calling out orders in a voice that probably still worked on a parade ground. His limp was worse today, the weather probably, the way cold and rain made old combat injuries flare up. But he didn't slow down, didn't complain, because that's not what you did. Pain was currency in the veteran community. Everybody had it. Spending it bought you nothing. The Wall of Honor drew Bull's eye again, specifically to David's photo. His son smiled out from behind glass, forever 22, forever proud in his uniform, forever about to deploy to a war that would kill him. Bull wondered sometimes what David would think of him now. Would he be proud of his old man, still showing up, still fighting the slow war against despair? Or would he be disappointed that Bull hadn't done more, been more, mattered more by him? The thoughts spiraled, the way they always did when Bull let his guard down. He pulled his attention back to the coffee, to the chessboard, to the cafe filling up with morning people who had jobs and futures and reasons to be alive that didn't require daily justification. At the counter, Sophie was dealing with a customer who wanted a complicated drink order. Half calf, soy milk, extra hot, with some kind of syrup Bull didn't recognize. Sophie's face remained professionally neutral, but Bull saw the tension in her shoulders. Too many demands, too much noise, too much civilian nonsense when her brain was still wired for threat assessment and rapid response. She'd be okay. She'd trained for this, same as all of them had trained to operate in civilian space while carrying combat trauma like concealed weapons. The cafe door opened and Bull's attention snapped to it automatically. Check the entry, assess the threat, plan the response. But it was just a kid, maybe 19, wearing a Portland State hoodie and looking lost. Not a threat, just lost. Bull forced himself to relax, took a long drink of coffee that burned his tongue, and returned to the chess game. Doc had moved his bishop, threatening Bull's rook. A trap, probably. Doc's chess game was all about patience, setting up positions 3 moves ahead, waiting for you to make the mistake he'd predicted. It was the corpsman's mindset. Treat the patient in front of you while preparing for the casualties you know are coming. Bull had learned not to rush against Doc. Rushing led to mistakes. Mistakes led to loss. Outside the window, Portland's morning rain settled into the steady drizzle that would last all day. People hurried past with umbrellas and coffee cups, heading to jobs in tall buildings downtown, living lives that had nothing to do with military service or sacrifice or the weight of bodies you couldn't save. Bull didn't resent them. They were the reason he'd served, to protect the right to live oblivious, comfortable, safe. But sometimes he envied them too, the way you might envy someone who'd never lost anything precious enough to grieve. The morning routine continued. Sophie brought refills without asking. Marcus worked the counter. Doc played chess. Bull sat at his table, holding the line against another day's darkness. This was the war now, not bullets and bombs, but routine against chaos, purpose against despair, showing up against staying in bed until death came calling. His hip ached where the rescue cable had bruised bone during the typhoon recovery. His hands trembled slightly from nerve damage, from age, from the accumulation of small injuries that added up to a body that barely worked anymore. But he was here, present, accounted for. Senior Chief Petty Officer William Carson, still at his post, still standing watch. Around 9:30, the morning rush began to slow. Students settled in with headphones and study materials. The remote workers typed away at their keyboards, building whatever it was people built on computers these days. Sophie took a break, poured herself coffee, and sat at the counter with her back to the wall. Marcus disappeared into the kitchen, probably to start prep for lunch service. Bull studied his chess position and tried to see the trap Doc had laid. The bishop threatening his rook was obvious. Too obvious. That meant the real threat was somewhere else. Some piece positioned to capitalize when Bull moved to save his rook. He traced the potential paths, the chains of consequence. If he moved his rook, Doc's knight could fork his king and queen. If he defended with his pawn, Doc's other bishop would open a diagonal that would cost Bull's his castle rights. There was a lesson in that, probably. Something about how the obvious threat often masked the real danger. But Bull was too old and too tired to extract wisdom from a chess game. He just wanted to not lose for another day. The cafe door opened again, and this time Bull's instincts proved correct. 3 men walked in, and everything about them said trouble. Not criminal trouble. They weren't armed, weren't looking to rob the place, but trouble nonetheless. Class trouble, money trouble. The kind of trouble that came from people who'd never had to fight for anything, looking at people who had lost everything fighting. The first man was tall, maybe 6'2", wearing a suit that probably cost more than Bull's monthly rent. 30-something, perfect hair, perfect teeth, the kind of polished arrogance that came from growing up rich and staying that way. He walked like he owned every space he entered, like his presence was a gift to the people around him. The second man was shorter, Asian features, expensive glasses, carrying an iPad in a leather case that matched his designer shoes. He followed the tall man like a pilot fish following a shark, close enough to benefit from association, but far enough to avoid being swallowed. Behind them, third man, silent observer. White, early 30s, expensive watch that caught the light. Something about him was different from his companions. Discomfort in his eyes, reluctance in his posture. But he was here with them, so he was complicit. Bull watched them get in line at the counter. Watched the tall one look around the cafe with barely concealed contempt, taking in the aged wood and community bulletin board and wall of honor like they were evidence of everything wrong with small businesses. His gaze swept past Bull's table, hesitated on the USS Constellation cap, and moved on without recognition. That told Bull everything he needed to know. The man looked at a Navy veteran's cap and saw only decoration, costume, a prop from someone living in the past. Didn't see service, didn't see sacrifice, saw only the costume of it, the performance. Marcus appeared at the counter, and Bull saw his old friend's shoulders tighten slightly. Combat veteran's sixth sense pinging on potential threat. But Marcus's voice remained professional, neutral, because you didn't survive 23 years in the service and 12 running a cafe without learning how to deal with assholes. The tall man ordered a caramel macchiato, something with 4 qualifiers that made Sophie's jaw tighten. The second man wanted a latte, specific temperature, specific milk. The third man, the uncomfortable one, just asked for black coffee, and Bull liked him slightly better for that. While Sophie prepared their drinks, the tall man pulled out his phone and started talking loud enough for everyone to hear. A performance, Bull recognized, the kind of performance people did when they wanted you to know they were important. Telling you, mother, the council made the right call. These programs are bloated, inefficient, and frankly, they enable dependency. Veterans need to learn to adapt to civilian life without constant handouts. Bull's coffee went cold in his mouth. The tall man continued, oblivious or uncaring. Exactly. 40% budget reduction frees up millions for actual productive investment. Education, infrastructure, programs that benefit everyone instead of just one demographic. Marcus set 3 coffees on the counter harder than necessary. The tall man glanced up, smiled the kind of smile that held no warmth. Thank you. He threw a $20 bill on the counter without waiting for change. The gesture said, I'm rich enough to not care about money, and you should feel grateful for my generosity. The 3 men looked around for seats. The cafe was fuller now, most tables claimed. Bull watched the tall man's eyes sweep the room and land on Bull's table. The corner spot, 4 chairs, only one occupied by an old man in a faded ball cap. No. Bull's internal alarm started ringing. This was his table, his post, his piece of ground. They could sit anywhere else. But the tall man was already walking over, confidence radiating from every step. He stopped at Bull's table, looked down at the old sailor like he was an obstacle to be managed. Excuse me, is anyone sitting here? The question was rhetorical. The man could see no one else was sitting there. This was a power play, a test to see if Bull would yield ground. Bull looked up, met the younger man's eyes, saw nothing there but entitlement and assumption. Saw someone who'd never been told no by anyone who mattered. This is my table. Simple statement of fact. No aggression, no challenge, just truth. The tall man's smile tightened. I don't see a reservation. This is a public establishment, right? First come, first served. Bull felt Doc shift slightly at the next table, moving into position. Felt Marcus stop what he was doing behind the counter. Felt Sophie's attention lock onto the situation with a combat veteran's focus. I've sat here every Tuesday for 12 years. This is my table. Well, the tall man's voice dripped with condescension. I'm here now. There are 3 of us, and you're one person taking up a 4-top. Seems like you could move to the counter and we could, no. One word, flat, final. The shorter man, the one with the iPad, touched his friend's arm. Brandon, there's a table by the door. Jason, this is fine. This gentleman was just leaving. Brandon's eyes never left Bull's face. This wasn't about coffee or seating anymore. This was about dominance, about putting an old man in his place. Bull stood slowly, joints protesting, back screaming, but he stood because you didn't yield ground to bullies. Not in combat, not in bars, not in coffee shops on Tuesday morning. At full height, Bull was still 2 inches shorter than Brandon, and probably 80 pounds lighter. But something in his posture, in the set of his jaw, in the absolute stillness of a man who'd faced actual danger and knew the difference between real threat and peacock display, something made Brandon hesitate. "This is my table." Bull repeated it without raising his voice. "You can sit anywhere else." Brandon's face flushed red. Embarrassment? Anger? Didn't matter. "Look, old-timer, I don't know what your problem is, but Senior Chief Petty Officer William Carson, United States Navy, retired." Doc's voice cut across the cafe from the next table. "And you'd do well to show some respect." Brandon turned, saw the white-haired hippie with the chessboard, and his sneer deepened. "Oh, I see. This is one of those veteran worship places. Listen, I respect your service. Really, but that doesn't give you special privileges in civilian life. You can't just claim a table. He can in my cafe." Marcus was there now, dish towel over his shoulder, arms crossed over his chest. The scar on his arm caught the light. "Bulls have been coming here 12 years. That's his table. Find another one." Brandon looked around, saw the wall of honor, saw the veterans sitting at other tables, saw the sign that read "Veterans Drink Free Tuesdays." Comprehension dawned in his eyes, followed by something that might have been disgust. "I see. So this is a, what, safe space for people who can't let go of their glory days?" He laughed, the kind of laugh designed to wound. "No wonder this place is always empty. You're catering to a demographic that's dying off." The cafe went silent, not the comfortable silence of people minding their business, but the dangerous silence before violence. Bull felt it in his bones, the shift from words to potential action. Felt Doc rising from his chair, felt Marcus moving around the counter, felt Sophie's combat reflexes engaging. Bull raised his hand slightly. "Stand down. This wasn't worth it." Brandon was just another civilian who didn't understand, didn't care, didn't matter. "You should leave." Bull's voice remained level, controlled. "You're not welcome here. I'm a paying customer." Brandon pulled out his wallet, threw a 50 on Bull's table. "There, I just paid for everyone's coffee. That makes me very welcome." Marcus was moving now, crossing the cafe with purpose. But before he reached them, Brandon made his mistake. He pulled out a chair at Bull's table and sat down. The action was so casual, so arrogant, so completely dismissive of everything Bull had said that something cracked in the old sailor's chest. Not rage. Rage was hot, impulsive, destructive. This was cold calculation, the kind that came from years of combat experience. This young man needed to be removed from Bull's table. The method mattered less than the outcome. Bull reached for his coffee mug, the blue one, the one he'd been drinking from for 12 years. His hand was steady despite the tremor, despite the age, despite everything. He lifted the mug with the deliberate care of a man who'd diffused unexploded ordnance. And then Brandon's arms swept out in a dismissive gesture, an emphatic point to whatever he was saying to his friend Jason, and his elbow connected with Bull's mug. The blue ceramic hit the table edge and shattered. Coffee went everywhere, across the table, across Bull's jeans, across the floor. Hot liquid soaked through denim, scalding the old sailor's thigh. The pain was sharp, immediate, real. Bull stood frozen, looking at his broken mug. 12 years. The same blue mug every Tuesday, filled by Sophie with coffee Marcus had brewed. The one piece of consistency in a world that kept taking things away. And now it was in pieces on the floor, pieces too small to glue back together. "Oh, whoops." Brandon's voice held no apology. "Sorry about that, Chief." Accidents happen. The way he said chief made it clear he didn't mean the rank. He meant it the way people said buddy or pal to men they considered beneath them. Bull's pants were soaked. Coffee dripped onto his shoes. The broken blue ceramic lay scattered like shrapnel. And something in him, the part that had held together through Sarah's cancer and David's death and 52 years of ghosts, that part started to crack. He bent to pick up the pieces. The movement made his hips scream, made his back seize, made him remember he was 78 years old and breaking down the way all old machines break down. His fingers fumbled with the ceramic shards. One cut his thumb, drew blood that mixed with spilled coffee. "Easy there, Grandpa." Brandon leaned back in his chair, Bull's chair, completely at ease. "Don't hurt yourself. At your age, A fall could be pretty serious. Bull's hand went to his chest automatically, touching the space where his Navy Cross should have been. But the medal was back in his apartment, hidden in a drawer, because Bull didn't wear it. Wearing it felt like lying, like claiming credit for failure. Except when he bent down, the top button of his flannel shirt came undone. The t-shirt beneath shifted, and hanging from a chain around his neck, visible for just a moment, was the unmistakable shape of the Navy Cross. Jason, the shorter man with the iPad, saw it. His eyes went wide. He knew what it was: second highest honor in the Navy, given for extraordinary heroism in combat. There were maybe 3,000 living recipients. Bull was one of them. Brandon, Jason's voice was urgent, quiet. That's a Navy Cross. Brandon glanced down, saw the medal, and something changed in his expression. Not respect, not shame. Something worse. Doubt, quickly masked by defensiveness. Probably bought it at a pawn shop. Brandon's voice was louder now, projecting. You'd be surprised what these old guys do for attention. Stolen valor is a real thing, you know. The words hit Bull like fists. He straightened slowly, carefully, buttoned his shirt back up. His jeans were soaked. His mug was broken. His table was occupied by someone who thought his service was a lie. Marcus was beside him now, hand on his shoulder. Bull, come on, leave it. Let me get you cleaned up. But Bull was looking at Brandon, really seeing him for the first time. Seeing not just arrogance, but fear underneath it. This young man was afraid of something, and he covered that fear with contempt. It was almost sad. Almost. I earned that medal. Bull's voice came out rough, forced through a throat tight with emotion he didn't want to show. October 18th, 1972, Typhoon Rita, Western Pacific. I was a rescue swimmer. 33 men went into the water. I saved 4. 4? Brandon's laugh was sharp, cruel. And they gave you their second highest medal for saving 4 people? Seems like a low bar. 27 drowned. Bull's hands were shaking now, and he couldn't stop them. I couldn't reach them. I tried. I jumped into water that could kill you in minutes. I tied a rope around my waist, and I went after them, and I couldn't get to all of them. The cafe had gone completely still. Even the espresso machine had stopped hissing. Every eye was on Bull and Brandon, and the terrible thing happening between them. Brandon's face was red now, his own discomfort manifesting as aggression. Look, I'm sorry you had a bad day at work 50 years ago, but that doesn't mean society owes you free coffee and reserved tables for the rest of your life. You made choices, you enlisted, you did a job. That job came with benefits you already received. Now you want more? You want special treatment because you're, what, a hero? He said hero like it was an insult. Bull felt something break inside his chest, not his heart. That had broken long ago and never healed right. Something deeper. The thing that made you believe your life had meaning, that your sacrifices mattered, that the world remembered and cared. I need to use the restroom. Bull's voice was barely audible. He turned and walked toward the back of the cafe, past the counter where Sophie stood, with tears in her eyes. Past the wall of honor, where David's photo watched him fail again. Past Doc, who was standing now with fists clenched. Bull walked like a man who'd been shot but didn't want anyone to know, holding himself together through pure discipline. The bathroom door closed behind him. Bull made it 2 steps before his knees gave out. He caught himself on the sink, looked up at the mirror, and saw the truth. An old man, used up, irrelevant, a relic from wars no one cared about anymore, carrying ghosts no one wanted to hear about. Brandon was right about one thing. Bull was dying off. His whole generation was dying off. And when they were gone, who would remember? Who would care that 27 men drowned in a typhoon? Who would care about David, about Sarah, about any of it? Bull's reflection stared back at him, with eyes that had seen too much and understood too little. The Navy Cross hung around his neck like an albatross, a constant reminder of the lives he couldn't save. His pants were soaked with coffee. His hands wouldn't stop shaking. And for the first time since Sarah died, Bull wondered if it would be easier to just stop. Stop showing up. Stop fighting. Stop pretending any of it mattered. He gripped the sink until his knuckles went white. counted to 10 in his head the way the VA therapist had taught him, breathed deep despite the tightness in his chest. This was just another Tuesday, just another asshole, just another reminder that the world had moved on and left people like Bull behind. But God, it hurt. It hurt worse than the typhoon cold, worse than watching Sarah waste away, worse than the phone call about David. Because those were tragedies. This was dismissal. This was being told that everything you'd sacrificed, everyone you'd lost, all of it was meaningless to the people you'd fought to protect. Bull splashed cold water on his face, looked at his reflection again, and tried to see the senior chief who'd once jumped into typhoons without hesitation. Tried to see the father who'd raised a son to be proud of service. Tried to see anything worth saving. What he saw was a 78-year-old man with wet pants and shaking hands and a broken coffee mug that somehow represented 12 years of barely holding on. Outside the bathroom, he could hear voices raised. Marcus arguing with Brandon, Sophie's voice joining in, other customers muttering. The normal sounds of a cafe in conflict. Bull could walk out there and diffuse the situation. Could leave with whatever dignity remained. Could come back next Tuesday and pretend this never happened. Or he could stay in this bathroom until they all left. Could hide like a coward while other people fought his battles. Could prove Brandon right about everything, that veterans were weak, broken people who couldn't function in civilian life. Bull's training kicked in. Senior chiefs didn't hide. Senior chiefs faced the problem head-on, regardless of cost. He'd taught that to dozens of sailors over 24 years of service. Couldn't abandon it now just because the problem was humiliation instead of combat. He dried his face with paper towels that were too thin and scratchy, straightened his flannel shirt, tucked the Navy Cross back under the fabric where it belonged, hidden, private, his burden to carry, looked at his reflection one more time, and made himself remember. He'd survived a typhoon that killed 27 men. He'd survived 3 combat deployments. He'd survived 18 months of watching Sarah die by inches. He'd survived the telegram about David, survived the funeral, survived every day after that when getting out of bed felt like an act of war. He could survive, Brandon. Bull opened the bathroom door and stepped back into the cafe, and stopped, because the cafe had changed. 6 men in black leather stood between Brandon's table and the door. Big men, heavily tattooed, wearing vests that said Hell's Angels across the back. And the one at the front, the biggest one with salt and pepper beard and arms like tree trunks, was staring at Bull's Navy cap with an expression Bull recognized. Recognition, respect, understanding. The man spoke and his voice filled the cafe. That's a Constellation cap. You serve on her? Bull's mouth was dry. 24 years. Senior Chief Petty Officer. The big biker's face changed. The hard lines softened. He put out his hand, scarred knuckles, faded tattoos, the kind of hand that had done hard work and harder fighting. Daniel Knox. My old man was Navy. Thomas Knox, corpsman with the Marines, 68 to 71, served on the Constellation. The name hit Bull like electricity. Tom Knox, from Detroit. You knew him? I knew him. Bull's voice cracked. Good man, best corpsman I ever saw. He still died 6 years ago. Agent Orange, I'm sorry. Danny Knox shook his head. Don't be. He lived longer than he should have. Said it was because men like you kept him alive long enough to get treatment. He talked about you. Danny's eyes flicked to Brandon, still sitting at Bull's table, then back to Bull's coffee-stained jeans, then to the broken blue mug on the floor. That your table? Bull nodded. Danny turned to look at Brandon, and the temperature in the cafe dropped about 20 degrees. 5 other bikers moved up behind him, forming a wall of leather and muscle and barely controlled violence. I think, Danny said, voice soft and dangerous, you're in the chief's seat. Brandon's face went pale. The cafe silent except for the hum of the espresso machine and the soft tap of rain against windows. 6 bikers formed a semicircle around Bull's table, blocking the exit, and every one of them had the look. The 1,000-yard stare that separated men who'd seen combat from men who'd only read about it. I said, Danny Knox repeated, each word deliberate as a hammer strike. You're in the chief's seat. Brandon stood, chair scraping loud against old floorboards. His hands went up in what might have been surrender or defiance. Listen, I don't want trouble. We just came in for coffee. Then you should have sat somewhere else. Tank Morrison stepped forward, the distinctive thud of his prosthetic leg punctuating each step. Left leg gone below the knee, blown off by an IED outside Kandahar. The man's arms were thick as most men's thighs, covered in ink that told stories Brandon would never understand. This table belongs to the chief, has for 12 years. Jason touched Brandon's arm, voice urgent and low. Brandon, let's just go, please. But Brandon shook him off, pride overriding survival instinct. This is America. I have as much right to sit here as anyone. You can't intimidate me just because you ride motorcycles and we're not intimidating you because we ride motorcycles. Luis Rodriguez moved closer, scar tissue from an IED blast running from his hairline down the left side of his face, pulling his eye into a permanent squint. We're asking you to show respect to a man who earned it. There's a difference, yes. Respect? Brandon's voice climbed higher, fear transmuting into anger. I'm supposed to respect someone who spilled coffee on himself and blamed me? Who sits in a cafe all day living off taxpayer money while the rest of us actually contribute to society? The words hung in the air like smoke from a discharged weapon. Bull felt them land, felt them cut, but before he could respond, Danny Knox did something unexpected. He laughed, not cruel, not mocking, genuinely amused. You think Bull's living off taxpayer money? Danny pulled out his phone, tapped the screen a few times, turned it to show Brandon. The chief volunteers 40 hours a month at the VA hospital. Mentors young vets who come home broken. Runs a support group for families of fallen soldiers. All unpaid. But yeah, you're right. He's the one not contributing. Brandon's mouth opened, closed. Jason was tugging his arm harder now, trying to pull him toward the door. The third man, the silent one, had already retreated to stand near the counter, clearly wanting no part of this. Sophie appeared beside Bull, dish towel in hand, expression carved from stone. Chief, you okay? You need first aid for that burn? Bull looked down at his coffee-soaked jeans, the scalded skin underneath probably blistering, but he couldn't feel it through the adrenaline and humiliation. I'm fine, Sergeant. You're not fine. Marcus was there now, too, and the combination of his daughter and his old friend bracketing Bull felt like armor, like a defensive position, like maybe he wasn't as alone as he'd felt in that bathroom. Sophie, get the first aid kit. Doc, can you look at this? Doc Patterson was already moving, medical bag in hand because old corpsmen never went anywhere without their kit. He knelt beside Bull with the efficiency of a man who'd treated worse in worse conditions. Pull up your pant leg, Chief. Doc, That wasn't a request. The old medic's voice carried the authority of a man who'd given orders under fire and expected them followed. Bull complied, rolling up the wet denim to reveal angry red skin, already forming blisters. Second-degree burn. Doc's fingers were gentle despite their weathered appearance. Could have been worse. Another 30 seconds soaking in hot coffee, and we'd be looking at third degree. Sophie, I need cool water, clean cloths, and burn cream if you've got it. Brandon watched this unfold with an expression Bull couldn't quite read. Shame, maybe, underneath the defensive posturing. Or maybe just irritation at being made to feel like the villain when he'd clearly come in here believing he was right. I didn't mean for him to get burned, Brandon said, but the apology came out defensive, grudging. It was an accident. Then you should have apologized. Danny's voice remained calm, but his eyes were flint. Instead, you called it whoops and told the chief to be careful at his age. That's not an accident. That's contempt. Jason had given up trying to move Brandon and instead stood frozen, iPad clutched to his chest like a shield. Something about his posture reminded Bull of young sailors on their first deployment, caught between orders from different superiors, not sure which authority to follow. The man looked miserable. Doc applied burn cream with the practiced efficiency of 50 years of medical experience. The cool gel brought immediate relief, enough that Bull could think past the pain. The cafe crowd had swelled, word spreading somehow, the veteran network activating. Bull recognized faces from the VFW post, from the Tuesday Breakfast Club, from the VA hospital waiting rooms. 20 veterans now, maybe more, filling Marcus Corner with the quiet presence of men who'd answered the call and knew what it meant to stand together. All due respect, Brandon tried again, his lawyer voice emerging. But this is getting out of hand. I came in for coffee, there was a misunderstanding, and now I'm being surrounded by... By what? Tank's question came soft as a knife blade. Say it, what are we? Brandon's mouth worked, but no sound came out. Whatever word he'd been about to use, some survival instinct kicked in and stopped him. We're veterans, Tank continued. Marines, Army, Navy, Air Force. We served our country. We lost friends. We came home different. And we take care of our own. Bull Carson is our own. You disrespected him. So yeah, we're surrounding you, making sure you understand the gravity of what you did. The gravity? Brandon found his voice again. Indignation overriding caution. He's an old man who won't give up a table in a coffee shop. That's not exactly Pearl Harbor. The temperature dropped again. Several veterans took steps forward. Danny raised his hand, hold position, and they stopped. But the threat hung in the air like electricity before a lightning strike. Get out. Marcus spoke for the first time since the bikers arrived, his voice carrying the flat authority of a man who'd given orders in combat. Brandon Mitchell, Jason Park, and whoever you are by the counter, get your coffee, get out of my cafe, and don't come back. You can't ban me. I'm a paying customer. I absolutely can. This is my establishment. I reserve the right to refuse service to anyone. You're refused. Leave. Brandon looked around the cafe, at the bikers, at the gathering veterans, at the wall of honor with its 200 faces of men and women who'd served. His eyes landed on David Carson's portrait, lingered there for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice had changed, some of the arrogance drained away. I'm sorry the chief got burned. That wasn't my intention. But I stand by everything else I said. These veteran programs are bloated and inefficient. The city council made the right decision, cutting funding. It's not personal, it's fiscal responsibility. Fiscal responsibility. Doc looked up from wrapping Bull's leg, 60 years of seeing men die for political decisions, heavy in his voice. Is that what you call it when you eliminate PTSD treatment programs? When you cut suicide prevention hotlines? When you close facilities that keep veterans off the streets? Those services are available through the VA. The VA has an 8-month wait list. Sophie interrupted, her voice tight with barely controlled rage. 8 months. You know how many vets kill themselves in 8 months while waiting for an appointment? 43. I know because I counted. I counted every single one because they were my brothers and sisters, and the VA couldn't see them fast enough. Her hands were shaking now, the combat veteran's tremor that came when PTSD triggers got activated. Bull recognized it because his own hands did the same thing. Recognized it because Sophie was experiencing now what he'd experienced 1,000 times, the helpless rage of watching preventable deaths happen because people like Brandon decided budgets mattered more than lives. Brandon's face flushed red. I'm sorry for your loss. But the data shows, fuck your data. Sophie never cursed, made it a point of pride to maintain military purpose near professionalism even in civilian life. But the word came out sharp and final. My data is names and faces and families that don't have fathers anymore because the programs you cut were the only things keeping those men alive. Jason Park stepped forward, placed himself partially between Brandon and Sophie, hands up in a placating gesture. Please, everyone, can we de-escalate? My friend spoke poorly. We'll leave. We're leaving right now. He grabbed Brandon's arm, and this time Brandon didn't resist. The two of them moved toward the door, giving the bikers wide berth. The third man had already slipped out, abandoning his companions to save himself. Smart or cowardly, Bull couldn't decide which. But at the door, Brandon stopped, turned, looked directly at Bull with an expression that might have been curiosity or calculation. The councilwoman who led the funding cuts, Andrea Mitchell. She's my mother. The words landed like ordnance. Bull's head snapped up. Marcus's hand tightened on the counter. Danny's eyes narrowed to slits. Your mother, Danny repeated slowly, is the councilwoman who just eliminated 40% of veteran services in Portland. She's doing her job, making hard choices for the good of the city. But Brandon's voice lacked conviction now, running on autopilot, defending a position he didn't quite believe anymore. Not everyone can get everything they want. Budgets require priorities, and veterans aren't the priority. Bull spoke for the first time since the confrontation began, his voice rough from the burn, from the emotion, from the weight of everything. We're the sacrifice. Again. Always. Something flickered across Brandon's face. Recognition, maybe, of a truth he'd been avoiding. But then his mask slammed back into place. The armor of privilege and certainty that had carried him through 34 years of never being told he was wrong. I'm sorry you see it that way, Chief. I really am. He pushed through the door, Jason following, and they were gone. The cafe exhaled collectively. Veterans began talking again. The background murmur of men processing violence that didn't happen, adrenaline that needed somewhere to go. Danny and his bikers remained in formation around Bull's table, a protective detail that hadn't been requested but appeared anyway because that's what you did when one of your own was under attack. Bull looked at the coffee-stained table, the broken blue mug still in pieces on the floor. Sophie was gathering the shards carefully, placing them in a plastic bag like evidence from a crime scene. Marcus had already started making a fresh pot, muscle memory taking over when the mind was still reeling. Thank you. Bull addressed Danny and the bikers, inadequate words for what they'd done, but all he had. You didn't have to. Yes, we did. Danny pulled out a chair, not Bull's chair, but one beside it, and sat. The other bikers did the same, forming a council of war around the table. Bull, you know who Andrea Mitchell is? City councilwoman, elected last year on a fiscal responsibility platform. I voted against her. She's more than that. Tank pulled out his phone, brought up a news article, showed Bull. The headline read, Councilwoman Mitchell targets wasteful spending. The photo showed a woman in her 40s, perfectly coiffed, standing at a podium with Brandon visible in the background. She's married to Senator Richard Mitchell. They're a political dynasty, and their son, Brandon, is being groomed to take over the family business. Bull studied the photo. The family resemblance was clear. Same sharp features, same calculated smile. A family that had never known want, never known sacrifice beyond what polling data suggested was politically advantageous. The council vote was last week, Luis added, pulling out his own phone to show documentation. 7-3 in favor of cuts. Andrea Mitchell led the charge. 40% reduction in veteran services, effective immediately. That includes the PTSD program at the VA, the suicide hotline, the homeless outreach, the job placement services, everything we've built over 20 years, gone. The information settled over Bull like a heavy coat. He'd known about the cuts, had received a letter from the VA explaining that his volunteer position was being eliminated due to budget constraints, but he hadn't connected it to a face, a name, a specific person who'd made the decision. Now he had, Andrea Mitchell, and her son, who'd sat at his table and called his service meaningless. There's a problem, though. Doc finished bandaging Bull's leg, sat back on his heels. It's not just politically motivated. There's something else. What? Marcus handed Bull a fresh mug of coffee. Not blue, just standard white ceramic, but hot and strong and exactly what he needed. The programs they cut are the same ones Sophie needs. Doc's eyes found Sophie, who'd stopped cleaning up broken ceramic to listen. For her custody hearing, she needs proof of completed therapy to demonstrate she's fit to parent Caleb. But the program she was in? Defunded. Session logs? Lost in the transition. Her therapist? Laid off. Sophie's face went white. No. The hearing is in 3 weeks. They told me if I complete the program and get certification, I'd have full custody. Without it, she didn't finish the sentence. Didn't need to. Everyone in the cafe knew what happened when the state decided a veteran parent was unfit. Caleb would go to his grandmother, Sophie's ex-husband's mother, who'd been fighting for custody since Sophie's PTSD diagnosis, who told the judge that a woman with night terrors and panic attacks couldn't possibly care for a child. Bull watched Sophie's hands start shaking worse, watched her breathing accelerate into the hyperventilation pattern that preceded panic attacks. Marcus was beside his daughter instantly, hand on her shoulder, grounding her with pressure and presence. Breathe, Sophie. In through your nose. Count to 4. Out through your mouth. Sophie followed her father's instructions, Combat breathing to override the panic response. Bull had done the same thing 1,000 times. Watched his own hands shake, felt his own chest tighten, forced himself to breathe when every instinct screamed that there wasn't enough air. When's the hearing? Danny's question was tactical, already moving to problem-solving mode. November 28th, 2 weeks. Sophie's voice came out thin, stretched. They moved it up from January, said they wanted to resolve the situation quickly, for Caleb's sake. I think his grandmother's lawyer pulled strings. And you need therapy completion certification by then. Yes. 12 weeks of PTSD treatment, proof of attendance, therapist evaluation. I was 2 weeks away from finishing when they shut down the program. Tank stood, started pacing. The prosthetic leg made a distinctive sound against the floor. Thud, click, thud, click. That Bull found oddly soothing in its rhythm. The man was thinking, processing, calculating. So we have 2 problems, Tank said finally. 1, the city council cut veteran programs. 2, Sophie loses her kid because of the timing. These problems are connected. How? Marcus asked. Because Andrea Mitchell doesn't just hate veteran programs. Tank stopped pacing, looked directly at Bull. She hates veterans. Her entire political career is built on the idea that we're drains on society. Leeches. People who did abide and now expect lifetime benefits. She says it in every speech, every interview, and her son clearly learned at her knee. Bull sipped his coffee, the hot liquid centering him. Somewhere in the back of his mind, beneath the pain and humiliation and rage, something was forming. A plan, a mission, the kind of clarity that used to come before combat operations when you stopped being afraid and started being focused. What's the council meeting schedule? Bull's question surprised even himself. Danny checked his phone. Next session is Wednesday, November 27th, day before Thanksgiving. They'll do public comment period, vote on the budget ratification, then recess for the holiday. Public comment. That means citizens can speak for 3 minutes each. But Bull, they're not going to reverse the decision. The vote already happened. This is just formality before they ratify. Bull set down his coffee mug, white, not blue, still wrong but functional. Looked around at the faces watching him. Veterans who'd shown up because one of their own was under attack. Men who'd served, who'd lost, who'd survived and were trying to find meaning in the wreckage. We don't need to reverse the decision, Bull said slowly, the plan crystallizing as he spoke. We just need to make them see us, make them see Sophie, make them see what they're doing. They know what they're doing, Sophie protested. They don't care. Maybe. But maybe if we show up, all of us, and we tell our stories, and we make it impossible for them to pretend we don't exist, maybe that changes something. Danny was nodding now, seeing where Bull was going. A show of force, not violence. Just presence. Fill that council chamber with veterans. Make them look at faces instead of budget lines. It won't work. Marcus's voice carried defeat, the sound of a man who'd fought bureaucracy too many times and lost. Politicians don't care about stories. They care about votes and donors in polls. We're not their constituency. Then we become their constituency. Tank resumed pacing, energy building. We organize. We call every veteran in Portland. We reach out to VFE, to American Legion, to every motorcycle club with a veteran chapter. We pack that chamber wall to wall, and when they try to ignore us, we make noise. That's not how public comment works, Doc cautioned. You get 3 minutes, you speak, you sit, no disruption, or they clear the room. Then we do it right. Bull stood, testing his injured leg. The burn hurt, but pain was information, nothing more. We prepare, we practice, we make every word of those 3 minutes count. And we don't go in there as individuals. We go as a unit, organized, disciplined, military precision. Something was shifting in the cafe. Bull could feel it, the aimless anger of minutes ago crystallizing into purpose. Veterans straightening in their chairs, eyes sharpening. The transformation from civilians back to soldiers happening in real time. Who's in? Bull asked the room. Every hand went up. 20 veterans, maybe 25 now as word spread and more arrived. A platoon's worth of men and women who'd served their country and were being told their service didn't matter. Danny stood, and when he spoke, his voice carried the command authority of a Marine gunnery sergeant. All right, listen up. This is now a military operation. Mission objective: restore veteran service funding. Secondary objective: secure Sophie's custody of Caleb. Time hack: 13 days. He pulled out a notebook, started writing. We need intel, logistics, and manpower. Bull, you're mission commander. You know these programs better than anyone. Marcus, logistics. Your cafe is base of operations. Tank, you're on intel. Find out everything about that council meeting, who's voting, what the procedures are, how public comment works, orders given, accepted without question. This was the language they all spoke, the structure they understood. Give veterans a mission and they became soldiers again. Bull felt it in himself, the transformation from humiliated old man to senior chief petty officer, officer in charge, responsible for the mission and the men under his command. Doc, medical support. Make sure everyone testifying is healthy enough to handle the stress. Luis, community outreach. Contact every veteran organization in Portland. We need numbers. The bikers dispersed to their assignments, pulling out phones, making calls. The cafe transformed into a command post. Tables pushed together to form a war room, veterans clustering in groups to plan and strategize. Sophie approached Bull, eyes red but determined. Chief, I can't ask you to do this for me. The custody battle is my problem. It's our problem. Bull's hand on her shoulder, the same gesture Marcus had used earlier. When they cut programs that leave veterans hanging, that's all of us. When they try to take your kid because you have PTSD from serving your country, that's all of us. We fight together or we don't fight at all. I don't know how to thank you. Thank me by winning. Keep your son. Be the mother he needs. That's thanks enough. Marcus appeared with fresh coffee for everyone, moving through the cafe with renewed purpose. The despair that had hung over him earlier, the knowledge that his daughter might lose everything, had transformed into focused energy. He had a mission now. Missions could be completed. Bull's phone buzzed, text message from an unknown number. This is Jason Park, Brandon's friend from the cafe. I need to talk to you, alone. It's important. Bull showed the message to Danny, who frowned. Could be a trap, could be the son trying to gather intel for the mother, or could be someone with information we need. Bull texted back, Marcus's corner, 7 p.m. tonight. Come alone. You sure about this? Danny asked. No, but we need to know what we're up against. If this Jason has intel, I want it. The afternoon blurred into evening as veterans arrived in waves. VFW members in their 80s, Vietnam vets who rarely left their homes anymore, but heard the call and answered. Gulf War vets like Marcus, still young enough to fight but carrying wounds that would never heal. Iraq and Afghanistan vets, Sophie's generation, trying to find their place in a country that had moved on from their wars. By 6 p.m., 70 veterans packed Marcus' corner beyond fire code capacity. Marcus didn't care. Let the fire marshal try to clear a room full of combat veterans on a mission. Danny stood on a chair, called for attention. The room fell silent instantly. Command voice worked on soldiers regardless of how long they'd been out. We have 13 days to prepare. The council meeting is Wednesday, November 27th, 10 a.m. Public comment period starts at 10:30. We need speakers, people who can articulate what these programs mean, what cutting them costs. 3 minutes each. I'm making a list. Hands shot up. More volunteers than they could possibly use. Danny started taking names, building a roster, organizing the chaos into structure. Bull watched from his table again, reclaimed from Brandon's presence, and felt something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. Not the desperate hope of a drowning man grasping at wreckage, but the solid hope of a mission that had a chance of success. At 7 p.m. exactly, Jason Park walked through the door. He looked different without Brandon. Smaller, uncertain, stripped of the borrowed confidence that came from association with wealth and power. He scanned the cafe, saw 70 veterans staring at him, and nearly bolted. Bull raised his hand. Jason, over here. The young man approached like he was walking through a minefield. Danny and Tank positioned themselves on either side of Bull's table, not threatening, but present. Jason sat carefully, hands visible on the table, body language screaming that he meant no harm. Thank you for coming. Bull's voice neutral, giving nothing away. I needed to. Jason's hands were shaking. What happened this morning? I can't stop thinking about it. Brandon was wrong. The things he said to you were wrong, but you didn't stop him. No, I didn't. Jason looked down at his hands. I should have. I wanted to. But Brandon is my boss and my friend, and I was a coward. Bull studied the young man, saw genuine remorse, genuine shame, but also saw something else, the same conflict he'd seen in young sailors who wanted to do right but didn't know how to stand against authority. Why are you here, Jason? Jason pulled a photograph from his wallet. Old, faded, protected in plastic. An Asian man in U.S. Army uniform, Korean War era, young and proud. My father, Park Jin-soo, Army Infantry, 1951 to 1953. He died when I was 14. Agent Orange complications from service near the DMZ. The photograph hit Bull like a fist. He took it carefully, studied the young soldier's face, saw determination there, saw pride, saw the same expression David had worn when he enlisted. I never told Brandon. Jason's voice cracked. About my father being a veteran. I was ashamed. Not of him, of myself, for being the son of a veteran in a world that doesn't care about veterans, for knowing what my father went through and hiding it so I could fit in with people like Brandon. Danny leaned forward. Your father served honorably, came home to a country that spit on Korean War vets. And you, what? Pretended he didn't exist? Yes, Jason's face crumpled. I pretended. And this morning when I saw your Navy Cross, Chief Carson, I remembered my father's Silver Star. In a box in my apartment, never displayed, never shown to anyone, because I was ashamed to be associated with veterans. Bull handed back the photograph. What changed? You did. What Brandon said to you about stolen valor, about living off taxpayers, about being irrelevant. That's what I've been telling myself about my father for 20 years. That he was embarrassing. That his service didn't matter. That the world had moved on. Jason wiped his eyes roughly, but seeing you stand there with your coffee-burned leg and broken mug, and seeing you refuse to back down, I realize I've been the enemy. Not Brandon. Me. The cafe had gone quiet, everyone listening to this confession. Bull felt the weight of it, not just Jason's personal shame, but the broader truth it represented. How many sons and daughters of veterans had been taught to be embarrassed by their parents' service? How many had learned that patriotism was unfashionable, that military service was for people who couldn't get into college, that veterans were damaged goods? What do you want from us, Jason? I want to help. I want to make this right. I know Brandon's testimony for the council meeting. I wrote it. I can tell you his arguments, his tactics, everything the Mitchell family is planning. Tank and Danny exchanged looks. This was intelligence gold if Jason was genuine. But if he was a plant, feeding them false information to make them look foolish, how do we know you're not setting us up? Tank's question blunt, no softening. Jason pulled out his phone, played a recording. Brandon's voice came through the speaker. Jason, make sure the testimony emphasizes generational freeloading. Hit them where it hurts. Make these old vets look like parasites on society. Use statistics about fraud, about waste, about how many veterans are in prison. Make them seem dangerous and pathetic at the same time. The recording played for 2 minutes. Detailed strategy for dehumanizing veterans, for making the budget cuts seem not just reasonable but morally necessary. When it ended, Bull felt sick. That's from this afternoon, Jason said, after we left the cafe. Brandon called me to prepare for Wednesday. He doesn't know I recorded it. He doesn't know I'm here. If you testify against him, you lose your job. Doc's observation clinical, factual. I already quit. Sent my resignation email an hour ago. I can't work for someone who thinks my father's service was meaningless. Bull saw it then, the transformation Jason was undergoing in real time. From complicit enabler to active ally. The same transformation Bull had seen in himself years ago, when he'd finally admitted his PTSD needed treatment, when he'd stopped pretending he was fine and started asking for help. "Welcome to the fight," Bull said and offered his hand. Jason took it, shook with surprising firmness. "Thank you, Chief. I won't let you down." "Don't thank me yet. We haven't won anything. We're just getting started." Danny stood, addressed the cafe. "Change of plans. We now have inside intel on the enemy's strategy. This just became a winnable fight." The cafe erupted in grim satisfaction. Veterans who'd come expecting to make a symbolic gesture now saw actual victory as possible. The energy shifted from defiance to determination. Bull's phone buzzed again. Text from a number he didn't recognize. "Chief Carson, this is Dr. Elena Rodriguez, VA Hospital Psychiatry. Heard about the council meeting. Count me in. I'll testify." Then another text from a VFW commander. "Bringing 30 men Wednesday. All Vietnam vets. We remember when they cut our programs too." And another from an American Legion post. 25 Iraq/Afghanistan vets. Sophie's generation. We'll be there. The network was activating. Word spreading through the veteran community like fire through dry grass. By 8 p.m., Danny had commitments from over 200 veterans to attend the council meeting. By 9 p.m., that number hit 300. Bull watched it happen, felt the momentum building, and thought, maybe we can win this. Maybe we can save Sophie's custody. Maybe we can restore the programs. Maybe we can make them see us as human beings instead of budget lines. Or maybe they'd fail. Maybe the council would rubber stamp the cuts and move on. Maybe Sophie would lose Caleb. Maybe Bull would go back to his apartment and his ghosts and his broken coffee mug, and nothing would change. But at least they'd fight. At least they'd stand. That's what veterans did. They stood when standing was all that was left. Marcus closed the cafe at 10 p.m., later than usual, but nobody wanted to leave. The planning continued, veterans forming committees, assigning tasks, building the operation with military precision. By midnight, they had a battle plan. By 1 a.m., they had testimony outlines. By 2 a.m., exhaustion drove everyone home except Bull, Marcus, Danny, and Doc. The four old warriors sat at Bull's table, drinking coffee that had gone cold hours ago, looking at the wall of honor with its 200 faces. "We're really doing this," Marcus said, half question, half statement. "We're really doing this," Bull confirmed. "And if we lose?" Bull thought of Sophie, of Caleb, of all the veterans who'd texted their support tonight, thought of David's face on the wall, forever young, forever proud. "Then we lose standing up, better than dying on our knees." Danny raised his cold coffee mug. "To the last mission." They clinked ceramic against ceramic. Four old men who'd fought in 4 different wars, united now in one final battle. The last mission had begun. Wednesday morning arrived cold and gray, Portland rain drumming against the windows of Brandon Mitchell's downtown apartment. He'd been awake since 3 a.m., staring at the ceiling, replaying yesterday's confrontation in an endless loop. The look in Bull Carson's eyes when the coffee spilled. The Navy Cross hanging from that chain. The way 70 veterans had filled Marcus's corner with the kind of presence that made Brandon feel small in ways money never could. His phone sat on the nightstand, 37 missed calls from his mother. He'd ignored every one. The resignation email to Mitchell Capital had been sent at 2:47 a.m., formal and final. No explanation, no room for negotiation. Just, effective immediately, "I resign my position as CEO. Please direct all transition questions to the board." The Mitchell family empire didn't matter anymore. What mattered was the equation Brandon couldn't solve. How does a man who's spent 34 years being wrong become right? He dressed in jeans and a plain sweater. No suit, no armor of wealth. Looked at his reflection and saw someone he didn't recognize. Or maybe someone he'd never allowed himself to see. His phone buzzed. "Jason, meeting the vets at Marcus Corner, 9 a.m. You coming?" Brandon stared at the message. Showing up meant admitting everything. Meant facing Bull Carson again. Meant stepping into a world where his name, his money, his family connections bought him nothing but contempt. "I'll be there," he typed back. The walk to Marcus' corner took 20 minutes through rain that soaked through his jacket. He could have driven the Tesla, but somehow that felt wrong, like showing up to a funeral in a party bus. The cafe appeared through the downpour, warm light spilling from windows, and Brandon's stomach twisted into knots. Inside, the planning session was already underway. 50 veterans packed the space, Danny Knox standing on a chair with a whiteboard covered in tactical markings. Brandon stepped through the door, and the room went silent. Bull Carson sat at his corner table, white mug of coffee steaming in front of him. The old sailor's eyes found Brandon's, held them for a long moment. No anger there, no forgiveness either. Just assessment, the way a commander evaluates a new recruit who might wash out or might prove himself. Jason appeared at Brandon's elbow, voice low. "You okay?" "No, but I'm here." Danny climbed down from the chair, walked over. The Marine was 6 inches taller than Brandon and probably 80 pounds heavier, all of it muscle and scar tissue and hard-earned authority. "You lost? I want to help." Brandon's voice came out steadier than he felt. "With the council meeting, with Sophie's custody case. Whatever you need, why?" Danny's question held no hostility, just genuine curiosity. 24 hours ago, you were calling us parasites. What changed?" Brandon thought about lying, about offering some sanitized version that made him look better. But these men had survived wars by recognizing bullshit from a mile away. "I went home yesterday and looked at myself in the mirror and saw my mother, saw my father, saw everything I hate about people who've never had to fight for anything, never had to lose anything that mattered." He met Danny's eyes. "I don't want to be them anymore. I want to be better. And I don't know how, but I'm asking you to teach me." The cafe remained quiet. Veterans watching, evaluating, deciding whether this rich kid's conversion was real or performance. Bull stood slowly, testing the burn on his leg. Walked over to where Brandon stood, dripping rainwater on the floor. Up close, Brandon could see the lines around the old sailor's eyes. The permanent exhaustion of a man who'd carried too much for too long. "You know what the hardest part of being a rescue swimmer was?" Bull's voice carried through the cafe. "Watching men drown because I couldn't reach them all. 27 in one night. I had to choose who to save and who to let go. Live with that choice every day since." Brandon waited, knowing this was a test. "You want to help? Really help?" Bull continued. "Then stop talking about what you want and start doing what needs doing. Marcus needs $50,000 in 2 weeks or the bank takes his cafe. Sophie needs therapy certification or she loses Caleb. We need 300 veterans organized for the council meeting. Those are the missions. You capable of completing missions?" "Yes, sir." "Then prove it." Bull turned back to his table. Over his shoulder, "And Brandon? Don't call me sir. I work for a living." The old Navy joke broke the tension. A few veterans chuckled. Danny clapped Brandon on the shoulder hard enough to hurt. "All right, Boot, you're in. Tank, get him up to speed on logistics. And Brandon, you fuck this up. You answer to me." Tank Morrison pulled Brandon to a side table covered in spreadsheets and budget documents. The big Army Ranger with the prosthetic leg wasted no time on pleasantries. "Marcus is $48,000 in debt. Business loan he took to renovate 3 years ago, payments current until his supplier chain collapsed during COVID. Bank wants full payment by December 10th, or they foreclose. Standard predatory lending bullshit." Tank slid a document across. "You understand corporate finance? I have an MBA from Wharton and 10 years experience in capital markets." "Good. Then figure out how we restructure this debt, negotiate with the bank, or raise the cash. You've got 13 days. Brandon studied the numbers. The cafe's revenue was steady but not spectacular. Profit margins thin. No way Marcus could raise $50,000 through normal operations, and the bank had already rejected 2 extension requests. "I can't restructure if the bank won't negotiate." "Then find another way." Tank's voice held the flat certainty of a man who'd learned problem solving under fire. "You're supposed to be some financial genius, right? So be genius." Across the cafe, Sophie was briefing a group of younger veterans on the custody situation. Brandon watched her hands shake as she explained the timeline, watched her father stand close enough to catch her if she fell. This woman had survived Iraq, survived PTSD, survived single motherhood, and now some bureaucrat was telling her she wasn't fit to raise her own son. Brandon pulled out his laptop, started running calculations. Traditional fundraising would take months. Bank loans required collateral. Marcus didn't have. Private investors would want equity. Marcus couldn't give up. But his mother's upcoming council meeting had media attention, local news covering the Veteran Services debate, public interest in the outcome. And Brandon had learned from his father that media attention could be monetized if you were smart about it. What if we go public? Brandon looked up at Tank. Not with the debt, with the story. Marcus is a Gulf War veteran who opened a cafe to serve other veterans. The same city cutting veteran programs is now forcing him out of business through predatory lending. That's a narrative people care about. You want to crowdfund? I want to create a fundraising campaign that ties Marcus's situation to the broader veteran services cuts. Show the human cost of these policies. Get local news coverage, social media attention. Make it impossible for the city to ignore. Tank considered this, prosthetic leg drumming against the floor. That could backfire, could make us look like we're begging, or it could show we're fighting. Brandon was warming to the idea now, seeing the strategy crystallize. We frame it as, the city cuts programs, veterans have to save each other. We're not asking for charity, we're asking the community to stand with veterans the way the government won't. Sophie appeared beside them, arms crossed. You're talking about my father's business, his livelihood. You better be damn sure this works before you make him into a poster child. Brandon met her eyes, saw the protective fury there, the daughter guarding her father the way he'd once guarded her on battlefields. I'm not sure. I can't promise it works, but I can promise I'll put everything I have into making it work. My connections, my money, my reputation, what's left of it. All of it goes into saving this cafe. Sophie studied him for a long moment. Then, why? You don't know us. Yesterday you were calling us parasites. Yesterday I was an asshole. Today I'm trying to be better. Brandon pulled up his banking app, showed her the screen. I'm putting in the first 10,000. Anonymous donation, no strings. That's my buy-in. My proof, I mean this. Sophie looked at the transfer confirmation, then at Brandon, then at her father behind the counter. Marcus had stopped making coffee to watch this conversation, his Gulf War veteran instincts assessing threat levels. Dad, Sophie called across the cafe, come here, we need to talk. The next 2 hours blurred into planning. Brandon drafted the crowdfunding campaign while Tank handled media outreach. Jason, who'd been working quietly in the corner, revealed he had contacts at local TV stations through his law firm. By noon, they had commitments from 2 news crews to cover the story. Danny coordinated the council meeting preparation with military efficiency. Speakers were selected, testimonies drafted and rehearsed. 3-minute time limits enforced ruthlessly. No rambling, no emotion without purpose. Every word calculated for maximum impact. Bull sat at his table throughout, the calm center of organized chaos. Veterans approached for guidance, for approval, for the reassurance that this mission was worth fighting. The old sailor dispensed wisdom in small doses. Conserving energy Brandon could see was running low. Chief, Brandon approached the table. Hard hammering? Can I ask you something? Bull gestured to the empty chair. Up close, Brandon could see the burn bandage on the old man's leg, could smell the antiseptic cream. How do you live with failing people? Brandon kept his voice low, private. You said you couldn't save 27 men. How do you wake up every day knowing that? Bull sipped his coffee, took his time answering. You don't live with it. You live around it. You build a life that honors the ones you lost by helping the ones you can still reach. Some days that's enough. Some days it's not. But you keep building anyway. I've never failed anyone who mattered. Never lost anything I couldn't replace. How do I become someone who understands what that means? You listening to Sophie talk about losing her son? Yes. You helping Tank with the cafe finances? Yes. Then you're already becoming it. Bull set down his mug. Brandon, being better doesn't mean being perfect. It means showing up when showing up is hard. It means using whatever skills you have, even the ones you learn from people you don't respect, to help people who need it. You've got financial knowledge. Use it. You've got media contacts through your family. Use them. Being better means being useful. The words hit like a benediction. Brandon nodded, unable to speak past the tightness in his throat. Thursday morning brought the first news coverage. A reporter from KGW News interviewed Marcus in the cafe, cameras capturing the Wall of Honor, the reserved table with Bull's name, the community of veterans who'd made this place home. The story ran at noon. Veteran cafe fights for closure amid city budget cuts. Within hours, the crowdfunding campaign hit 15,000. By evening, 25,000. Comments flooded in from across Portland, across Oregon, across the country. Veterans from other states sending $50, $100, whatever they could spare. Civilians writing messages of support. My father served. Thank you for taking care of our veterans. Brandon worked the phones, calling bank executives he'd dealt with professionally, leveraging relationships he'd built over a decade in finance. Most conversations went nowhere, bankers protecting their bottom line. But one, a VP at First Portland Bank named Sarah Chen, listened to the whole pitch and said, "Let me see what I can do." Friday afternoon, Sarah called back. The bank would restructure the debt, 48,000 spread over 5 years at reduced interest. First payment due in 90 days instead of 2 weeks. Marcus would keep the cafe. Brandon delivered the news in person, watching Marcus's face crumple with relief, watching Sophie hug her father while tears streamed down both their faces. The cafe erupted in cheers, veterans pounding tables and embracing, the victory tasting sweeter because it had seemed impossible 3 days ago. "You did this." Marcus gripped Brandon's hand, the handshake of a man who'd learned to judge character in combat. "You saved my cafe. We did this. All of us." But Brandon felt the weight of it, the responsibility and the privilege of being useful instead of ornamental for the first time in his life. Saturday morning dawned clear and cold, the rain finally breaking. Veterans Charity Ride Day. Danny's Hells Angels had organized it annually for a decade, raising money for VA programs. But this year carried extra significance. Every dollar raised was a middle finger to the city council's cuts, proof that veterans would take care of their own when the government abandoned them. Bull arrived at Marcus Corner at 8 a.m., dressed in his navy dress blues for the first time in years. Sophie had helped him press the uniform, had pinned his ribbons and medals with shaking hands, had cried when he allowed her to pin the Navy Cross over his heart where everyone could see. "You sure about this, Chief?" Sophie's voice wavered. "You always said you didn't want to wear it." "I was wrong." Bull adjusted the medal's weight, feeling the physical and emotional heaviness of it. The 27 deserved to be remembered. David deserves to be remembered. And if wearing this helps Sophie keep Caleb, helps save Marcus's cafe, helps show those council members what service means, then it's time I wore it proud. The parking lot filled with motorcycles as Hells Angels from 3 states converged. Harleys and Indians and vintage bikes, each one immaculate, riders in leather vests covered with patches, telling stories of brotherhood and loss. Danny's crew formed the core, but they'd been joined by Rolling Thunder, Patriot Guard riders, Veterans MC chapters from Seattle and Sacramento. 200 bikes, 400 riders. And at the center, Bull Carson in dress blues with the Navy Cross catching morning sun. Tank had fitted his bike with a sidecar, custom built with suspension that wouldn't jar Bull's injured leg. The old sailor settled into the padded seat, oxygen tank hidden in a compartment underneath, because pride only went so far, and passing out on a motorcycle seemed counterproductive. "Comfortable, Chief." Tank straddled the bike, engine rumbling to life. "Been in worse places." Danny raised his hand, the signal rippling through 200 riders. Engines roared in unison, the sound rolling across Portland like thunder. Police escort lights flickered at the front of the convoy. Permits obtained, route approved, everything by the book because veterans understood following rules better than most. The ride rolled out at 9 a.m. sharp. Through downtown Portland, past City Hall where next Wednesday's battle would be fought, along the waterfront where crowds gathered to watch and wave flags. Bull felt the wind on his face, felt the vibration of Tank's Harley through his bones, felt more alive than he had in years. They passed the VA hospital first. Symbolic, intentional. Staff came outside to watch, patients in wheelchairs lining the entrance, some crying, all saluting. Elena Rodriguez stood at the front, white coat over scrubs, hand over her heart. She'd be testifying Wednesday, putting her job on the line to speak truth about what cutting programs would cost. Next stop, Forest Park Memorial. 200 bikes circled the monument, engines cutting to silence. Bull stood slowly from the sidecar, walked to the wall where David's name was carved, traced the letters with fingers that trembled from age and emotion and the weight of 13 years carrying grief. Behind him, 400 veterans stood at attention. No one spoke. The silence held space for all the names on that wall, all the faces that would never age, all the families that would never be whole again. Bull spoke to the stone, voice carrying in the quiet. David, I'm wearing the Navy Cross today. First time since they gave it to me. I'm wearing it for you, son. For the 27. For Sophie, who's fighting to keep Caleb. For all of them. I hope that's okay. I hope you understand. A hand settled on his shoulder. Danny standing beside him, then Tank, then Luis and Raymond and a dozen other bikers, all of them understanding what it meant to talk to ghosts, to carry names that demanded remembering. They hear you, Bull. Danny's voice rough with emotion. They all hear you. Final stop, Marcus's Corner. The cafe had been transformed overnight. Banners hung from the building. Veterans Charity Ride, supporting those who served. News crews set up cameras. Councilwoman Maria Santos stood near the entrance, the one council member who'd voted against the cuts, showing support the only way she could before Wednesday's vote. Brandon worked the crowd, no longer the awkward interloper, but a committed member of the team. He'd raised an additional $30,000 through his network, matching every donation dollar for dollar from his personal funds. The money would go to VA mental health programs, to homeless veteran outreach, to exactly the services the city had defunded. Sophie appeared carrying a microphone, the small PA system from inside the cafe. Her hands steady now, purpose overriding anxiety. Can I have everyone's attention? Her voice cracked slightly, cleared, strengthened. I'm Sergeant Sophie Hayes, Iraq War veteran. Next Thursday, I face a custody hearing that will determine if I keep my son. The programs that were helping me prove I'm a fit mother were cut by the city. But you know what? I'm going to win anyway, because I'm not fighting alone. She gestured to the crowd, 400 riders, hundreds more supporters, journalists documenting everything. We don't need the city's permission to take care of each other. We don't need their approval to stand together. Veterans have always had each other's backs. That's not changing because some politicians decided we're too expensive. Applause rippled through the crowd. Bull watched from Tank's sidecar, pride swelling in his chest. This was what service looked like after the uniform came off. Taking care of the next generation, standing up when standing was required. Brandon stepped up beside Sophie, visibly nervous but determined. My name is Brandon Mitchell. Some of you know that name because my mother led the council vote to cut veteran services. I'm here to say she was wrong, I was wrong, and I'm committing $100,000 of my own money to veteran programs in Portland. Not as charity, as repayment for a debt I owe to people like Chief Carson, like Sergeant Hayes, like every person here who served while I was building a career that only served myself. The crowd's response was muted. Brandon hadn't earned their trust yet, wouldn't earn it with money alone. But he'd made a start, small steps toward becoming someone worth respecting. Danny climbed onto a picnic table, Marine Corps command voice cutting through conversation. Wednesday morning, 10 a.m., City Hall. We show up in force, we tell our stories. We make them see us as human beings instead of budget line items. And we win back what they tried to take. Hoo-yah, the Navy vets. Hoorah, the Marines. Hoo-ah, Army voices joining. Bull stood in the sidecar, unsteady but upright. The crowd fell silent, waiting for the old sailor's words. I've lived 78 years, fought in wars most of you weren't born for. Lost friends, lost my son, lost my wife. Spent a long time thinking my service didn't matter because I couldn't save everyone. But this week taught me something. He touched the Navy Cross over his heart. It's not about saving everyone. It's about standing for anyone, about using whatever time we have left to make things better for the people coming after us. Sophie's fighting for her son. Marcus fought for his cafe. All of you are fighting for programs that save lives. That's the mission now. Not glory, not medals, just service. Still serving, always serving until there's nothing left to give. He sat down hard, strength giving out. But the message had landed. The crowd pressed forward, not to mob him, but to be close to someone who'd walked the path they were walking, who understood the East and paid it anyway. The ride ended with $200,000 raised, media coverage on every local station, and a community of veterans more unified than they'd been in decades. Bull rode back to his apartment in Tank's sidecar, exhausted but satisfied, the Navy Cross still pinned over his heart. Wednesday would bring the real battle. Wednesday would determine if all this effort meant anything. But today, Saturday, watching 400 veterans stand together in common cause, today was victory enough. Marcus Corner stayed open until midnight, veterans sharing stories and coffee, and the unspoken understanding that they'd found something worth fighting for. Bull sat at his table, white mug refilled countless times, accepting gratitude he still didn't think he'd earned. Sophie brought Caleb in at 8 p.m. The boy should have been in bed, but some nights routine mattered less than presence. The 12-year-old wore a too large Navy surplus jacket, dog tags hanging around his neck. "Chief Bull?" Caleb's voice small but determined. "Mom says you're a hero, that you save people." Bull looked at the boy, Sophie's son, the reason all of this mattered. "I tried to save people. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't. But you tried. That's what matters, right?" From the mouths of children. Bull ruffled Caleb's hair, feeling something in his chest unclench. "Yeah, sailor, that's what matters." The boy saluted, crisp and serious. Bull returned it with the respect due a fellow warrior, and Caleb beamed. At midnight, Danny locked the cafe doors behind the last veteran. Only the core group remained. Bull, Marcus, Sophie, Doc, Tank, Luis, Brandon, Jason. 8 people who'd started the week as strangers or enemies and ended it as something like family. "Wednesday," Danny said, no elaboration needed. "Wednesday," they echoed. Bull walked home through Portland streets wet with fresh rain, dress blues still pressed, Navy Cross still visible. His apartment waited, 300 square feet of loneliness and ghosts. But tonight the ghosts felt quieter. The 27, David, Sarah, they felt less like anchors and more like companions. Less like failure and more like reason. He hung the dress blues carefully, the Navy Cross still pinned over the heart. Tomorrow he'd return it to the velvet case in his drawer. But Wednesday he'd wear it again, one last time, for the mission that mattered most. A text came through as he lay down. "Marcus, thank you, Bull, for everything." Bull typed back, "Thank you for giving me a place to stand." Sleep came easier than it had in years. No nightmares, no drowning men, just deep, dreamless rest that felt like permission to finally put down weight he'd been carrying too long. 4 days until the council meeting. 4 days until they learned if standing together was enough. But tonight, William Bull Carson slept like a man who'd completed his mission. Tomorrow would bring new battles. Tonight brought peace.